Oh boy. All right, let's get into it. A spoiler-free review of Madam Web starring Dakota Johnson. This is a standalone, quote-unquote, superhero movie. She plays a paramedic who discovers she has the ability to see into the future, and she's connected with these three other teenagers, and they are trying to avoid being killed by this really weird villain who has a long history with the mom of Dakota Johnson. And that is really all the story that is in this movie. Oh my gosh, okay, I'm gonna compose myself. The thing about this movie and what I've shared with you on this podcast is that I don't like to read reviews and I will not seek them out going into a movie. I don't listen to anybody else on TikTok, which I know is probably contradicting myself because I want you to listen to me, but I don't do it as a reviewer because I don't want my thoughts tainted by somebody else. I don't want to even resemble an opinion that somebody else has because then it won't feel like me. So I still did not read any individual review. I didn't listen to anybody on TikTok, but it was hard to avoid all of the articles and Rotten Tomatoes posting nonstop and just seeing the headlines, which is really all I saw going into this movie. And I feel like my perception of the movie was already tainted because people are calling this movie the worst Marvel movie of all time. They are dragging Dakota Johnson. They are dragging the director. And I feel like when that happens, people tend to pile up. And with all these movie influencers and other YouTubers and podcasters, I often feel like sometimes one person who is established has an opinion, and everybody else who kind of runs in that same circle starts having that same opinion because they don't want to look like, oh, if they had that opinion and I actually liked it, what would that say about me? I don't care about that. If I genuinely like this movie, I would tell you. But going into this movie, I already had this perception that it was going to be so bad, so I was bracing for impact. I was expecting to watch the worst garbage of all time. And in the past couple years, there have been maybe 2 or 3 movies, maybe 4, that I've wanted to walk out of. And I was prepared to have that kind of emotion going into this movie. And maybe it's because I had that brace for impact mentality that I don't think it was as bad as I was expecting it to be. I was expecting it to be a turd on the screen, and that is not exactly what happened. Did I love the movie? By no means. Was it a good movie? No. But I do think there is kind of an audience for this movie. Bear with me. Now, look at me. If you're watching on YouTube, or if you're a longtime listener here, part of the movie crew, you know I love Spider-Man. Have this entire studio decked out in Spider-Man comics. I am wearing my Spider-Man shirt today. I think that is who this movie was for. Now, this movie comes to us from the Sony Spider-Verse, not the MCU, which is another big issue they have here. Dakota Johnson herself might have not even known that she wasn't joining the MCU. She was joining the Sony Spider-Verse. 2 very different things. One of them gives us the Avengers, gives us Iron Man, all of those. And the other one has given us, in recent years, Venom, Morbius, and now Madam Web. So it is viewed as being the lower tier Marvel. But I feel as a just general moviegoer, you might not know that. My wife, Kelsey, who is as in tune with movies as much as I am, didn't really know the difference. Dakota Johnson herself and all the press she did for this movie, I am convinced she thought she was a part of the MCU. There's this whole theory going on of, is the Sony Spider-Verse kind of tricking actors into thinking they're joining the MCU, thinking they're going to be in a Marvel movie and have the same kind of prestige that comes along with taking one of those roles. I don't think that's completely true because there has to be agents, there has to be managers, there has to be somebody telling these actors, hey, you're joining the Sony side, you're not going to be on the Disney side. But in all the interviews that Dakota Johnson gave, she was talking about how all the movies are connected. She's not that familiar with Marvel movies. She doesn't really know a whole lot of female Marvel superheroes. One of my favorite clips was somebody giving her an actual comic of Madam Web, and she was like, oh boy, because she is not familiar with the source material. I don't think she's ever watched a Marvel movie, to be honest. And I feel like that's also why some nerds, like myself, are a little bit hurt, because we think when actors take on these roles, they spend all this time doing research, reading comics, watching all the other movies. At the end of the day, they are actors. They are the elite of Hollywood. They don't watch these movies like we do. They are not nerds like us, despite the amount of effort that we want them to put into it. They're not going to do it. For some of these actors, it is merely a paycheck, and then sometimes just a step to take on another project. I really got that perception from Dakota Johnson, and I like her as an actor. I've come on and defended her and said that she is one of the most underrated actors in Hollywood. And it's weird that you take on one not so great role and people change the perception of you. I find myself struggling with her right now because I feel like she was trying to just be her authentic self in interviews and all the promotion leading up to this. I saw a lot of people saying they wanted to cancel their tickets. She was trying her hardest. But if you have hardcore Marvel fans coming at you with the first edition of Madam Web in the comics and expecting you to know about it, it is going to be tough. I think her team should have trained her a little bit better on how to answer some of these questions, because I was surprised to see how empty the theater was that we went to on a Friday night, a 7 o'clock showing. The theater was very, very empty. I've gone to a lot of Friday night, Thursday night showings for movies that have been kind of wishy-washy. Even Argyle had more of an audience in there. It was crazy to me how much of an influence that all these negative reviews had on this movie, because in my heart, I don't think it's an all-out, just terrible, terrible movie. It has a lot of issues that I want to get into now, but I think a lot of it roots from the $80 million price tag, which Dakota Johnson was paid $5 million for this role. And the $80 million budget really shows in this film, because we were teased in the trailer with all of this action. Sydney Sweeney in the suit. They had her in the promo talking about how she wanted her character Julia to repel because it was iconic. There was very little action in the suits in this movie, and they tried to disguise it with a story that was really just paper thin. You would drop this thing in water and it would dissipate because the story was so weak. It tried to create this mystery with Madam Web developing her powers of predicting the future and trying to figure out her past with her mom. And it also just teased us with Spider-Man being connected with this story, which I think that is who this movie was set to be for, was hardcore Spider-Man fans like myself. We're going to go watch these movies because we just want any kind of inkling of our favorite web slinger. And they were just kind of throwing it out there so randomly and so just like, here you go, you nerds. And that is exactly how I felt watching this movie, that Sony, in association with Marvel, thinks that us nerds will just go watch anything. They'll take it all in and we'll make some money off of it. Throw $80 million, we'll make that money back. It was not the case here. And I want to criticize Dakota Johnson so hard for giving a very dull performance. She was trying her all. She was giving it her best effort, but I almost felt like I was still watching her on Saturday Night Live. She gave an interview 2 weeks before the premiere saying, I don't know if it's good or not. I was acting on a blue screen for a majority of the film. It felt weird. All of these warning signs I saw going into this film, it was going to be really hard to come back from that. And that is what you have here. She is trying her all to act her way out of a hole, but she has no tools around her. The villain in this movie, his dialogue felt so AI generated, and I don't know what this villain personality was. Now, I don't think this is one of the worst superhero movies of all time, but it definitely has the worst super villain of all time. Miserable I was watching his performance because it was like a cliche 90s villain that you would make fun of in an Austin Powers movie. It was so bad. And he even had like this secret lair with somebody behind the chair running all of these monitoring systems. It was awful. Worst supervillain of all time. And the reason I wouldn't call it a worst superhero movie of all time, because it is hardly that. Madam Web in this movie is not a superhero. It is all the standalone backstory leading up to the superhero moment, and then it cuts you off. That's enough for you. You're not getting that. Anything that started to resemble anything from the source material from the comic was left out of this movie, except for one detail. And by the time we got to that, it felt so awkward and so off-putting that it made zero sense. probably 30 minutes worth of story spread out over an hour and 45 minutes, maybe a little bit over. And you could tell in this movie, it was like they used that editing tool where you stretch something out because you don't have enough material. That is what they did. There were scenes where they were driving, nothing being said, nothing happening, and they just put this very generic score over it and gave about a 30-second buffer to get to the next scene. It felt like they had a script and they were trying to meet a certain word count. Like back in 8th grade when I was trying to write a paper that needed to be 3 pages long, and I'm like, all right, let's just, instead of using contractions, you start spelling out some words. That is what this movie was doing, and it was completely noticeable. They thought I wasn't going to catch it. And I think it goes without saying, but the $80 million budget also hurt the visual effects. So when it comes down to it, this movie was just hard to take seriously because it was soap opera level acting, 2000s video game graphics, and a cheesy story with no mystery whatsoever that I didn't really care what was going to happen to these characters. Nothing heroic happened. There wasn't any superhero action. It was really just Dakota Johnson learning how to predict the future and running away from the villain the entire time. And it was the fact that nobody in this movie questioned anything. They just went along for the ride and then got there and were like, okay, I guess we're just following Dakota Johnson throughout this entire movie. I kind of feel like my parents, whenever they told me, I'm not angry with you, but I'm disappointed. It almost just felt worse when they were just disappointed in you. That is how I felt about this movie because I'm such a big Spider-Man fan, and I still don't know why they thought Madam Web is one character that needs their own movie. They should have just put Sydney Sweeney in the Spider-Woman suit and called it a day. That would have been a more entertaining movie. However, I'll go back to the last bad movie I talked about, which was Argyle. I thought that movie obviously wasn't worth the theater experience, but also wasn't worth streaming. For Madam Web, since it got so much hate, and since I still dedicated myself to watching it so I could share my honest thoughts with you, I still think when it goes to streaming, maybe whenever it's available for free on Netflix, just give it a watch to get a perspective on exactly what went wrong here. So if you are a diehard Marvel fan, a diehard Spider-Man fan, I would still not recommend. Maybe it's kind of like when you watch something bad to realize how bad it is. That is the only reason I would say it is worthy of a stream, because this will be referenced a lot as being one of the worst superhero movies of all time, even though I don't think it's the worst of all time. I've seen some really bad, awful movies. I'm looking at you, DC, and I still don't know why Marvel allows this, to put out such an inferior product in association with their name, because people sometimes don't know the difference. That being said, for Madam Web, I give it 1.5 out of 5. Oh, I don't even care to be creative here. They didn't care to be creative. Let's just do red jackets that Dakota Johnson was wearing awkwardly in this entire movie.